Welcome, welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And as I've mentioned this before, that so much of Tetze, deals with social, social legislation. And again, we're dealing with how do you deal with poverty? How do you deal with the underprivileged? And I think the Torah is sensitive in the kinds of legislation because essentially it's saying to the farmer that he has to do various different things in order to allow the poor to gather from his produce, right? So there's the payah where a corner of the field is left untouched for the poor to come and harvest there. There is what we were talking about, which are the gleanings, the shikha, meaning the forgotten sheaf, right? That if you're harvesting and you forget a sheaf, you're to allow the poor to come. And here we're talking about gleanings, different kinds of situations where you don't pick every single thing that you have planted, etc., and to allow the poor to come and gather it. And I realize our society doesn't allow us to act to it because we're not an agricultural society to that degree anymore, that these laws might not apply in their original form. But the point that I think was making is that they're not handouts. They're not just a matter of giving it to the poor, but rather that the poor need to come and gather it themselves. And the thought that's occurred to me, this is for a long time now, when I read about these laws and meditated a little bit about them, was the idea that giving people gifts in some ways is humiliating, that in some ways it lowers self-esteem to feel that you're so dependent on the gifts of others. And that by allowing, first of all, it also allows a certain level of anonymity. The poor come, they gather these parts of the harvest. They don't need to confront you and see your mood and your attitude, or whether you lack generosity, or whether you're feeling somehow superior. I mean, that whole idea, there's that whole sort of psychological dynamic involved in taking care of the underprivileged to make sure that their level of self-esteem isn't reduced even more than whatever it is because they're in such a poor state. And I think the Torah, in its legislation, is very sensitive to that by saying that it is the duty of the farmer, it is a mitzvah, a positive mitzvah. And yesterday we were talking about the fact that in some cases these positive mitzvahs are stated more than once. In one case, they're just stated generally, and here in Deuteronomy, they're stated in relationship to the poor, to say that you're to give the poor these. And and Rashi explained that the reason why the need for the repetition is that if in fact you do not practice these things, uh, you are guilty in terms of the poor for two mitzvot and not just one. And I think that is the way the Torah is trying to say that, human nature may not want to do these kinds of things, or not want to believe that we don't own everything that's in our possession, but that in fact we need to reinforce that notion, and that our responsibility to those who are underprivileged is a deep divine responsibility, that it is something that God wants of us. And to put things in that kind of terminology, I think helps strengthen that idea. But the idea that because people are in difficult circumstances doesn't mean they should be made to feel worse about it than they do already. And Rashi yesterday also talked about the term evyon, right? Ani is someone who's poor. Evyon is somebody who's destitute. And Rashi quoted a passage either from the Talmud or from Sifrei, excuse me, to take this word and link it to a word ta'av, which means, in a sense, to lust after because of the desire. And it's because someone in that situation, they desire everything. They have so nothing, right, that they desire everything, and that's why they're called an evyon. So, with this little bit of a continuation, introduction, review, we'll go into the text itself. So now we talked about, so just about above, what we did finished off yesterday. Just this is talking about the forgotten sheaf in the field, etc. And now we're going on to different. Ki tachbot zetecha, when you beat your olive tree. So the way they would harvest the olive tree is, of course, when the fruit had ripened enough, by shaking it or beating it, the fruit would drop down, and they then gather the fruit and process the olives, right? So we're talking here about the olive trees, and says, Lo tefa'er acharecha. So this word pa'er generally means glory, something like that. And I looked at the Aramaic, and there's the word in Aramaic tefale, and then looked up the root fale in Jastro, and that means search, and he also refers to it as glean. So interesting, right? The use of this particular word, which pe'er generally means something of glory, a crown, something like that. So in other words, don't crown this tree. In other words, go after all the olives on it. Okay. And in some ways, I think Jester also mentions that it could refer to getting the olives that are sort of around the side of the tree, something like that. So let's see. Here we go. Lager layatom val almana, to the non-Israelite, right, the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, they shall belong. It's so interesting, right? The terminology. They belong to them. They don't belong to you. Even though it's your olive tree, they don't belong to you. And imagine if we could look at our quote charitable giving in this context as saying, no, this is theirs. They have every right to it. Again, underscoring that idea of having some self-respect. So, so Rashi, of course, looks at this tefa'ir because, as I can tell you, in this context, it's an unusual usage. So he zeroes in on it, right? And he quotes the Talmud, Chulin Kuf Lamed Aleph. And Chulin basically has the laws of Shechita and it refers to non-sacred. That's what Chulin means. In other words, meat that isn't to be put on the altar, but the kosher meat that we get at a kosher butcher, the way that's to be processed to make sure that it's kosher, etc. So Chulin deals, amongst other things, with this element of life. So he says, Lo titol, do not take tifarto mimenu, its crown from it. So in meditating a little bit, why this term crown? And that's because a crown is essentially an adornment. It's not clothing, right? And if we were to say, apply this metaphorically, the fruit of the tree, of the olive tree, is in its sense, it's clothing. And the fruit that does not fall when you do that initial harvesting, that initial beating, is to look at it, as it were, as an adornment and not part of the actual part of the tree that is to be harvested. So do not take its crown, its splendor, menu from it. And here we go. This is what he says. Mikan, and from here, shemenichin pe'ah le'elan. That what we're doing is we're applying the idea of the corner of the field that we already read in the context of harvesting a grain field, right? The pe'ah is that corner. So we should, and Sepharia was very helpful in its translation there. And they say we need to leave unharvested the outer edge of the tree. So we can see that also as a crown, right? It's on top of the tree and around the tree, just like a crown is around the head, etc. So just trying to understand, but again, it still begs the question of what is the deeper meaning going on here? So just some thoughts involved, not by any means exhaustive. So then it says acharecha, right? Let's take a look right here. Acharecha, after you. So that's also like shicha, right? After you, because we used in gleaning the field, or rather in harvesting the field, the shicha, that is the forgotten sheaf. The shkoach means to forget, right? If you forgot to harvest it or to pick it when you were harvesting the field, that this term acharecha, behind you, is a reference to shikha. So what I think Rashi is trying to point out or bring to our attention is the idea that the way in which we're treating this olive tree is as if the olive tree itself is a field, right? And to apply the same basic principles that the Torah is simply applying the same basic principles to the olive tree as we would to a field going on. Ki tivtzor karmacha. So the word tivtzor is a verb in Hebrew that applies specifically to a grape harvest, to harvesting grapes. So again, as an agricultural society, generally, whatever society specializes in, it creates technical terms and special terms for that particular discipline that's involved in. And so because the Israelite society was so agricultural at this particular point, we have a unique word to describe harvesting grapes. We don't have that. I don't know that we have. I mean, we have the term vintage in English as well. Clearly, grapes play a very important part in society. But at any rate, in here we actually have a word, a verb to refer to harvesting grapes. Kerem is your vineyard. So when you harvest the grapes of your vineyard, lo te'olel acharecha. So this word le'olel, okay, Rashi is going to explain to us, but basically it means you shall not take single bunches of grapes. And the way in which the vine produces grapes is, as you know, very often it'll produce bunches, right? But on occasion, it'll produce single strands of grapes or individual grapes, etc. Sometimes, and basically, as we'll see in the Rashi, this is telling you that you're not to take these like single sections of the grapevine, that you're only to take the full bunches of grapes, the full clusters of grapes. And why? Lager layatom v'almana. And again, the Torah notices saying to the non-Israelite, to the stranger, to the orphan, and to the widow, they will be. Again, emphasizing they aren't yours, they are theirs. We can understand it in that way. Let's take a look at the Rashi. So, of course, he's going to look at lo te'olel, right? Im matzata bo olelet. So there we go. So if you find on the grapevine, and we're going to not translate this for now, olelet, if you find an olelet, lo tikachena. So the point is, you shall not take it. You shouldn't harvest it, right? And again, now from I think this is the Mishnah, because if I'm not mistaken, the tractate Pe'ah, which of course is named after the corner of the field, so it talks about these social legislation with regard to agricultural laws, just a sort of a major expansion of what we're dealing with, the subject we're dealing with now. But it says Pe'ah Zion, and I have to think it is, first of all, that it's chapter 7 of Tractate Peah in the Mishnah. There is no Babylonian Gemara on Peah. The reason why is because this section of the Mishnah called Zra'im, uh, it deals with these agricultural laws that apply only to the land of Israel. These particular laws that we're reading right now are understood to apply to the land of Israel and nowhere else, not outside the boundaries. That is to say that in Israel, it is a mitzvah to do these kinds of things. If you don't do them in Israel, you're abrogating a positive commandment. Outside, I'm sure if you want to act in generous ways to the poor, yes, but it's so interesting that even here in the Torah, we see that the land of Israel, the land itself, doesn't actually belong to the Jewish people. That would be a wrong way of understanding it. We'd say that it is on, let's say, relative permanent rental to the Jewish people, that the Jewish people have a responsibility for the caretaking of the land of Israel and for making it a place where where divine rule can actually be established and experienced. And the temple is simply one way, one expression of this divine rule and this experience. So seeing the land of Israel as some sort of nationalistic kind of thing, the truth is that nationalism didn't exist until the French Revolution. I'm not saying there may not have been certain iterations of it, but essentially the French Revolution established the whole notion of nationalism. And I will tell you that I feel that on some levels, nationalism is an idolatry, because at least if we understand idolatry as placing in a level of ultimate importance to anything other than the divine creator. So anyway, just getting back into the topic here, the Eza hi olalot. So what are these olalot? What are we talking about? So the Talmud defines what we're talking about. Kol she'en la katef, in other words, any cluster of grapes that does not have a shoulder, right? So you can picture to yourselves what a typical grape cluster looks like, right? It's like a inverted triangle. And I think here we're talking about the upper parts of that triangle. Velo netef, and it doesn't have a droplet. So you can picture again this cluster of grapes, very wide in the top, and then narrowing down to a single grape at the bottom. So if it doesn't have that, it is called an olalot. But let's take a look, right? Uh, so, so it has ein la katef, doesn't have the shoulder, velo netef, nor this drop. Yesh, however, in other words, it says it has to have the olalot, which, by the way, is plural, right? In other words, it has both these qualities. Okay, so here we go. Yesh la echad meham. However, if it has a shoulder and it doesn't have a droplet, or if it has a droplet and doesn't have a shoulder, if it has one of them, hare hu labalabait. In that case, it does in fact belong to the person whose field it is. Then it belongs to the owner of the field. Vera'iti Talmud, and Rashi, it's lovely because in a way he's saying something personal here, right? He says, I saw in the in Talmud Yerushalmi, and that is because the Talmud Yerushalmi essentially is the Talmud of the land of Israel. It does have the Talmud, right, a Gemara for this part of the Mishnah. It does have a full Gemara on these various agricultural laws because in the land of Israel they applied. So if you understand the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, it's there in terms of application. In other words, in Babylonian Talmud, remember, was written in Babylonia, essentially, and so it refers to being in exile. So all these laws that are dealt with strictly in the land of Israel are excluded from the Babylonian Talmud, and it essentially deals with laws that can be practiced. One exception has to do with laws of sacrifice. So the Babylonian Talmud has a tractate, Zvachim, sacrifices, that deals with these particular laws of sacrifice, partially because we don't want to forget them. And this is very important, that studying these laws, even if you can't do them, and the reason you can't do them is because you no longer have a temple, but the fact that you continue to study them in this circumstance is as if you're practicing it. It's as if the temple never got destroyed because it's gone, but it's not forgotten, and in fact becomes a very essential part of one's religious practice. So that's why when it comes to many of these temple laws, it is still studied in the Gemara and in the Yeshivot. So here we go. Talmud Yerushalmi. Ezahu katef, right? So again, what do we mean in the katef? Right? We said katef, right? So drilling down a little further, what do we mean by a katef? So he says psikin ze al gav ze. In other words, psigin would be sprigs joined to the vine, right? One above the other. So in other words, we're looking at a straight line, I think, down, vertical line of grapes, right? Netev. Okay, so what about the netev? Because there was the other word, drop. I translate it as droplets, right? Elo looks like ha, I'm trying to think. Hatluyot b'shidra v'yordot. So that the shidra would be like the spine. Shidra is your backbone, but here we're talking about, of course, the grapevine, and it's saying the main stem. In other words, they're attached to the main stem of the grapevine. Okay, and come down along that way too. So essentially, we're looking at a very similar ways in which the vine produces fruit, and what belongs to the farmer, and what is to be given to the poor. And with this, we will end today's lesson. So I'm just gonna move the. Okay. I'll do one more verse though. There's no Rashi on this, but let me finish this up. V'zacharta, and you shall remember. In other words, the context in which you should practice all of this. V'zacharta, you should remember. Ki evet hayita be'eretz Mitzrayim, that you were a slave in the land of Egypt. And this is not the first time we've had this particular verse attached to these agricultural and social laws, right? You were a slave. And now you're not a slave anymore. And the reason you're not a slave anymore is because God redeemed you from the land of Egypt. And so the wellspring of practicing mitzvot, I believe, and it's something that came to me only relatively recently, believe it or not, because it sounds so obvious that it's surprising that I didn't come on it earlier, is out of a deep sense of gratitude to God, this incredible sense of appreciation, which leads to love and leads to a desire to do whatever it is that God asks of us. And that, I think, is essentially a foundational value within Judaism. That yes, we do the mitzvot out of a sense of loyalty, but I think what we really are seeking is to be able to do this out of a sense of being able to express the gratitude and the thanks that we have. Because when you really, really, really feel a sense of gratitude, it becomes now a challenge in which to express it adequately. When you really love the person who gave you these particular things, you yearn for ways in which to express that gratitude, and mitzvot essentially are that. And of course, you want to thank a person the way they want to be thanked. That's the whole point, right? It's not for you necessarily to decide how they're to be thanked, but part of that act of thanking is trying to know that person well enough to be able to give them what they want. And these are really very deep and fundamental values, but let me finish the sentence. Al kain, for this reason, Anochi mitzavcha, I command you, lasot et hadavar hazeh, to do this particular thing. Because if God had not redeemed us out of the land of Egypt, guess what? We'd still be slaves. We wouldn't be in a position then to do these particular things, to be able to give gifts to the poor. And the whole idea of being prosperous and being at the same time charitable and wanting to help others and feeling that that's an expression of appreciating the fact that God has made it possible for you to be prosperous, because we know there are people who are prosperous and overnight that prosperity just disappeared despite all their hard work. And to understand that, again, if we have both the means and the opportunity and the wisdom or the skills in which to do this, they're all gifts from God anyway. They all come from this divine source. And so that's part of our trying to raise our consciousness to be able to appreciate these particular things. And I'm going to stop the share right here. Any other comments? Beautiful passages. These are wonderful, wonderful moments in Deuteronomy for sure. Okay. I'll stop the recording.